All right, and can you see what my screen here? So double check to make sure everything works.
Good to go.
No. Okay, cool. We had some issues during the last summer thing. Want to make sure they were fixed on my end. So first, thanks everybody for coming. I really I'm honored by the invitation to come speak with you and to kind of give you my thoughts about how everything is kind of going as we approach the fall. I was commenting in the last session at the very beginning. I got a message that Texas Tech football has now been postponed to the spring, which I imagine is at least the entire Big 12, if not all football or all sports across the fall for colleges. So there's definitely some interesting movement that's happening every day where we don't really know what the fall is going to look like for anything, whether it's work, school, sports. We're definitely in this limbo area, and I hope today I can give some information that will aid in alleviating some of the stress and give you a framework to work from as we move into an unknown year of education. Originally, I was asked to present this at the Summer Institute for administrators and instructional coaches, and then they apparently liked it and asked me back. But the original question was what does blended learning online look like? And so I changed the title a little bit to this for a few reasons, but I really want to talk about what we should be looking at and some kind of best practices and some ways of thinking about instruction as we progress into the fall here. And there we go. So I'm going to talk about a few things really quick, what blended learning is, and then how blended learning relates to personalized learning, and then give some models for blended and personalized learning online, talk about some equity in online instruction, and then really what I think is important here is planning for whatever inevitability happens, again, related to COVID, and then some time for question and answers if you so choose. So I really don't like these about me introductions and stuff, but I think it's important to situate my experience and that it does relate to what you're doing, that I'm not just kind of pontificating some ideas that have been on the ground here. I am a former middle school teacher. I taught a little bit high school, but I really identify as a middle school teacher. Even to this day, that's a key characteristic of who I am. I'm now an assistant professor now of STEM education. As of a month ago, it was instructional technology. So I really try to bridge that gap between instruction and the tech side of things. And for those of you that either have me currently or have had me as a professor, you've seen a lot of this before. My prime areas, again, not just teaching, but I'm also a researcher, which is, I really look at STEM education, specifically technology and engineering, look at virtual learning platforms. A lot of my research is Khan Academy, IXL, and looking at the efficacy of that as well. And I think most importantly, how those things impact underrepresented student populations, and then my true passion, which is students in foster care and working within that system. So I'm not just, hey, I'm this professor who has never been in the classroom. I've been on the ground and I understand the struggle that you're going through. Fortunately for me, I didn't live that in the spring, but I can relate to what that looked like for you. And I think that background is important whenever I'm talking to teachers. So the first thing that came to mind when they said blended learning online was that it's an oxymoron, right? It's a statement that contradicts itself, like all of these oxymorons. And that was kind of the fun part of it, was trying to come up with, what does blended learning online look like, given that blended learning has historically been this framework where we have face-to-face learning, like our normal didactic instruction that we've been doing forever, and how do we incorporate technology and the internet into that framework? And that's really where blended learning has been up until very recently. And I'm fortunate to be with a team at Texas Tech that's really diving into what this looks like. And it's more the personalized side of it, what we can do with that integration rather than just how do we best integrate it. So as I said, I was a middle school teacher, so I researched things initially the same way, especially for a presentation, the same way a middle school student would, and that's Google Images. So I Google image searched, what is blended learning, or just blended learning, and this is the image that came up was these kids that are clearly engaged, and they're into it. Whatever's going on, they're doing it. And for those of you that have had this happen in the classroom, it looks great, especially if a principal walks in. I can show you some great teacher evals of mine where the kids were engaged and they were working on the computer doing something. Nobody knows what, but they were doing something. I can tell you for a fact that some of those, they were doing nothing. They weren't learning because I was still trying to figure out how to make that work. But every time a principal walked in the room, man, they loved it because my kids were engaged. They were doing stuff. They were relatively quiet, which is the hallmark of good classroom management. They were working on something. But what were they doing? And this picture made me think, just trying to answer that question, what could they possibly be looking at? Took me back to when I was their age and we had computer classes back in the 80s. And we would go into our computer lab and do this. And we all died of dysentery. And I remember playing this and a game called Number Munchers, which was the coolest game. And still, I wish I could find it now. And it was this great actual educational math game if you are just teaching rote arithmetic. But I remember playing a lot of Oregon Trail back when it was floppy disks and you had to insert the next disk to go to the next level or whatever it was. And the only thing I really learned from this blended learning, this technology class, was not to ford a river with oxen in a wagon because I always drowned. And this meets the criteria for blended learning if it's just bringing technological and internet resources into a classroom environment. But that's not what blended learning is. So I continued my Google image search and I found this. And this slide, I was looking at this and looking at the benefits of blended learning that according to this website they have. And this was a website that would gladly take your money and train you on how to do blended learning. And I started to read these things. And for those of you that have incorporated blended learning in your classroom, I want you to read these and tell me if any of them are true, because I don't think so. I know for a fact that a blended learning environment is not time saving. It might be later on and you're going to reap some of the benefits from it, but it is not time saving. What I teach my students is it time shifts and it gives you time to do other things, but it doesn't save any time. It certainly doesn't reduce cost. We have to bring in the technology, the infrastructure. We're paying in your district, if you're using, say, IXL or Imagine Math or any of those systems, those are very expensive. They are not reducing cost. I can print out worksheets a lot cheaper than I can use those programs, which are digital worksheets. Is it flexible? It can be. It depends on how you set it up. I've seen blended learning environments that are incredibly inflexible. In fact, if you've ever taken an online class, I find until I finally after 3 years of doing it, finally got my feet really underneath me teaching online. Now it's flexible, but it was not for 3 years. And it was incredibly inflexible because of the nature of designing en masse ahead of time the way you have to do for an effective environment. This increased return on investment, again, if we're reducing costs, we're probably not having this ROI discussion. And I don't think we should be talking about return on investment when it comes to kids. This is not a business model. But just having blended learning doesn't do that anyways. It doesn't increase learner engagement. It does not mean effective learning. It is not necessarily creative and it is not necessarily motivating. It can be those things, but that is not a benefit of blended learning. I can do all of those things in a completely teacher-centric environment and keep students engaged, make the learning effective, make it creative, and never bring a piece of technology into that classroom. So this is not blended learning either. What blended learning does and allows us to do is, first of all, it is structured, and it is more structured than most classrooms. As I said, mine was incredibly inflexible. Now it's incredibly flexible, but also quite structured. And so I've been trying to bridge that gap, and it's very difficult to do, especially since I teach teachers, I teach adults with real lives and all of these things going on. I have to create a structured environment that allows it to be managed, but also allows that flexibility and personalization. But what blended learning allows for, and what we couldn't really do before, is allow for true differentiation. And I remember this word when I was a teacher, and I hated when they said, well, how are you differentiating? Because I didn't even know what that word really meant, because I could not conceptualize how that looked in my classroom. And the way a lot of classrooms differentiation looks is giving more work to the GT kid, right, the bright kids, and giving easier work to our special needs kids. And that's not differentiation in any respect. In fact, I would say that that's wrong on both counts, that is limiting their education if you're doing it that way. But that's how we've seen it. But that blending, that the use of technology allows us to differentiate on a level it just wasn't possible before. Blended learning, it can be, like any instruction, rigorous. If done properly, it is a rigorous venture and a rigorous framework from which to teach from. But again, requires a lot of setup and structure to make it so. The biggest benefit, and this is why I said time shifting before, is it allows us to offload rote tasks and data tracking to the student. So programs like IXL or Lexia or even Google Classroom allows us to take tasks that before were us doing that, tracking student data, tracking student growth, grading students, especially if you're a math teacher, correcting and grading their worksheets and their homework to make sure that they are understanding the concepts as you're teaching them. Now we have programs that can offload and automate a lot of that. And what that does, especially when we give the data tracking to the students, is we're promoting then that student agency, that concept of we want to create a lifelong learner. Now we can do that with blended learning because we've given some of that responsibility to the students. They're responsible for tracking their data and bringing it to you and saying, look what I've done this week. And the last thing it does is it supports and promotes that idea of personalized learning, truly differentiating instruction for the individual. Now, I'm a believer in every student should have an IEP. Not from and everybody's heart just stopped, not from here's a set of rules that you have to follow as a teacher, a set of accommodations that you have to give. That's not what I mean, because I remember having 20 kids and 17 IEPs. I know what that heart-stopping, feeling was of, no, I can't do that again. What I mean is that we're creating an environment and using the technology and leveraging that tech to give our students the opportunities and the options that they want, that still allows them to learn the standards, to learn what we need them to learn, when we need them to learn it, but allows them the freedom and the flexibility within that system to learn in a way that is best for them. And I'm certainly not going to learning styles because it's an abhorrent thing and they don't exist. But if we get to the idea of learning styles and saying, well, I'm a visual learner, we can do that now. We shouldn't because it's not a real thing, but there are ideas and there are ways of learning that is better for that student, and they get to pick that. And that's what we can do through blended learning. So when I first got this question of what does blended learning online look like, I spent 2 days trying to answer that question and racking my brain and what does this really mean? And so again, I went back to my middle school research methods and I just researched teaching. And I searched teaching, not researched it. I just searched it. And this was one of the images that came up. And it's a pretty typical classroom. And if I go into most schools or any school in the United States or most countries, and this is what I'm going to see. I'm going to see the teacher at the front giving instruction to the students participating and giving some call and response back. So this is a pretty typical lesson and a pretty typical environment. And there are exceptions, and I'm sure some of you have those rooms that you go into and you go, wow, this is different. But you notice that it's different because it doesn't look like this. And so this is what teaching looks like. This is the image that you have in your head. And obviously this is completely contrived and is not real. But this is what people think. This is what we see. So we have that model. And this is what we did. We said, well, we're going to take this and, well, we're in quarantine now. We're going to use the same model. And there are Facebook groups and all kinds of resources out there. I'm in one called Pandemic Pedagogy, which I remember everybody at the beginning was just trying to figure out, how do I take the instruction I have and make it work online? And a lot of people were like, oh, Zoom is great, and we can do that. And then we started running into the problems that happened. So we went from this online model that has worked. We've had it in the United States for 100 years. It's worked well, but it's starting to fall apart. And in a virtual environment, it really falls apart, because what you have is, one student, their video's not working. They can't see you. Something's not working there. Another student, they have dial-up internet, or they're using a hotspot, and somebody's got to use the phone, so they disconnect. One student can't hear anything that's going on, or you can't hear them. You don't know because you can't hear them. One student's lagging and timed out. Another student's dog started barking, and 2 students didn't show up. And this is what you have, right? Assuming you have 9 students, which I know none of you have. But this is what happened. This has happened en masse and at scale. And we tried to use a model that works in person, but does not work online. And I would question whether it's the best model in person, but that's irrelevant to this conversation. It does work. So if you had asked me a year ago what my ideal physical classroom would look like, I would have told you, well, I want a classroom where there's no front of the room. I always set up my classrooms in like a U or a circle if I could. That way I could walk around. I like to pace when I teach and talk, and I like to move around, and that way I can see what everybody's doing. And I've always had a classroom structure like that. So if you had said, what is your ideal classroom structure? It'd be one without a front of the room, without a back of the room, where everybody could see, and it would look something like this, again, with 9 students. Right? It would look like Hollywood Squares, and you'd all gone, well, you're nuts. You'll never get that classroom, and you can never have this, right? There's no front of the room. I can see what everybody's doing. Everybody can see me. We can engage equally. And then we went to COVID-19, and this was what instruction looked like. If I had gone back to the 70s, 50 years, and said, soon, in the next half a century, education across the country is going to look like the opening credits to the Brady Bunch, nobody would have believed you. The technology didn't exist. The format didn't exist. Everybody would have said, no way, no how. Fast forward to spring of 2020, and that's exactly what school started to look like. It looked exactly like the intro to the Brady Bunch. And you had, in this case, I'm assuming a small group of students working with a teacher. I have no idea what the context is, but this looks like that type of environment. This looks like the teacher just told a bad joke. Look at the expression of the kids. It's the same one you get when you tell a bad joke. This is a classroom in 2020. So we go back to that model and we tried it here, but it doesn't work. And if you want proof it doesn't work, take a look at the environment in which you're sitting right now. This is not the model we have. I have a bunch of blacked out screens, muted microphones, because all of that noise and congestion bandwidth wise would make this an impossible, an absolutely impossible presentation to give. It'll work in a small group, but we can't do it en masse, and it doesn't work. And it doesn't work equitably. So I went back to what are our real core kind of concepts of a blended learning environment in a regular classroom, and then how do we make that online? So really I found it was these 3 distinct activities that we do. One is this individual and collaborative activity that is structured, that is defined, that allows the students to be working both independently and together on a project, not just filling out worksheets, but actually working on something meaningful. Then the other part of it is these online learning activities, and this could be online lectures. This could be using one of the many softwares that are out there, which are essentially digital worksheets, which in certain environments like math, that's a totally acceptable thing. These students need that rote practice. They need that drill and kill to a certain extent for certain, for certain content areas. So it's important. So we have those two things. And then the final thing, and this is what we've really been kind of preaching with our group and our paradigm from Texas Tech, is this idea of student conferencing. Having all of those other things offloaded frees up that time and shifts that time to the teacher to meet one-on-one with the students, where they're bringing their data, they're bringing their resources to you, and you're going through that, getting to know your students, getting to know their work, holding them accountable, setting goals, creating this student conferencing environment. And when you put all of those together, it looks like something elementary school teachers have been doing forever, and it's station rotation. They are going through these different rotations with you being one of the stations, and you facilitating this and monitoring this throughout the class. And this has worked. We've done this, and we know that it works. And why does it work? Well, negating the individual activities, which could be different across the board, but it has two core areas. One is this online learning activities where we're using software, and there's a million of them. We're simplifying data and use tracking, where we can see how long has a student been on, and better yet, they can see how long have they used the software. How many questions did they answer in IXL? How many minutes did they spend reading in Lexia? And they can collect that information, write it down, and bring it to us. So we're not the ones at the end of the day going through Excel spreadsheets, trying to track what our students are doing, how much they've been working, trying to grade it, evaluate it based on participation, or however your model looks. We have video lessons that we can bring into play, either created by you or found. Supplemental instructional materials, and we can offload those tasks, and that's the key. Then we bring them to the student conferencing, this one-on-one small group, either instruction or goal setting, or talking about what they're working on, developing that relationship with the student, building rigor into what you're doing, and setting goals that set them square into that zone of proximal development we all talk about. We can use that data to drive instruction. We can increase student agency by using that mechanism to have them self-monitor, which brings in metacognition and motivation along with it. And it allows us to identify problems as they come up. And one of the areas that this is just personally to me that really made a difference was when I was an undergrad and I was studying physics. And I'm a high school dropout. So my math background was 9th grade. And so a little over 10 years later, I'm trying to take calculus and differential equations. And I had no clue. I didn't know what trigonometry was. I didn't know what really algebra was, because all I had ever learned was basic 9th grade logic curricula back in the 90s. And I had no idea what I was doing. And I remember going to my professor during office hours. And because I was sitting there going through the problems with him, he saw I did not know how to manipulate fractions. I had absolutely no clue how to manipulate fractions outside of like a construction environment. I didn't know how to multiply or divide fractions. And so he had to teach me that in a very high level math class in order for me to be successful. But the only way he found that was by sitting down with me and seeing me screw those up so many times. And once that clicked, I could at least move on to the next step. I was never good at it, but I was okay. But without sitting down and doing that, he would have never seen that problem happen. And that's where that student conferencing can really come into play. So we go back to this idea of station rotation working in person. And how do we take that model that we know works and move it online? And my answer after 2 days of trying to figure this out was we just move it online. Because they can do individual and collaborative activities without being in a physical classroom space. In fact, I love informal learning environments, and I think we should do more of that in school. We have the online learning activities. All they need is access. And we can do student conferencing because we have the technology to do it. It is 2020. We have Zoom, Meet, Skype, name it, FaceTime, whatever resource you have to meet with your students, you can do that. And not only can you do that, but you can do it the same as you were before. I now, when I send out a meeting request, the subject is always meeting request, just so they know I'm looking for a meeting. And it'll just say meeting request. And I'll say, hey, I'd like a meeting about X, Y, and Z. When are you available? And I got a response back, well, I'm not meeting anybody in person because I'm immunocompromised. Sorry about it. It's from my bank. And I said, I meant meeting as in a Zoom meeting, because that's just what I'm used to now. Every meeting is online. I haven't had an in-person meeting in 7-8 months. And it's a really important distinction now. So that's how we're viewing this. So it's no different than we've been doing it. We just create that conferencing space differently. So when I got asked, what does blended learning online look like? I would say it looks like blended learning, and it doesn't look any different. The key is setting this up so that we're starting from that blended learning framework, so that if and when we move online, we can just seamlessly, or at least relatively seamlessly, put this into play. If we start online, we can start this framework, and then when we move in person, we just continue it, because it's a good paradigm. We see good results from this, both academically, cognitively, motivation. We see all of these increases when this type of framework is employed in the school. So there is no difference between the two. But the big thing that I want to bring in, because like I said, I talk about underrepresented pops, and I can never bring a presentation without having them at least addressed, is how does equity apply to blended learning? Because now, especially online, we found those equity problems in the spring. So a lot of you, I hope all of you have seen this graphic or some derivation of it. But equality is this idea of we bring the same supports for everybody. And that's pretty much what we do in a school. We bring all those informational supports and all the technology, and we bring that to everybody. And we don't do a lot of differentiation structurally, because a lot of times we don't need to. We can see a lot of those issues that are happening in real time and address them, because that's what we do. But what we're trying to what we've always looked at, and this was always the two pictures I was shown. I didn't know there was a third. For quite a while, but this idea of equity, that we bring in the supports that the individual needs, and we produce equity. So now everybody can see the gain, even though we've distributed those resources differently. And now, especially, if you follow any type of media, whether it's social or the news, but this idea of justice has finally become a wave, and it's become a real force. And we talk about justice a lot more, and what does that mean? And what it means is we're removing those barriers. And this is the idealistic view. This is what we hope to get to, but we can't always do that from our particular vantage points and the particular resources we have to work with. Our goal should be justice, but we should be looking at equity. And what can we do to make sure that everybody at least has the minimal supports they need to get the minimal level of equal access? And through all of the coronavirus post-mortem that we're currently going through, and how did we do? And I hear our wonderful education secretary publicly say what a terrible job we did with virtual learning. And no, we didn't. And I can always critique. I'm a Buffalo Bills fan. I can tell you 4 Super Bowls that I can critique what we did wrong and why we lost the game. But the bottom line is I wasn't on the field. And I can always sit there the next day and say what should have been different and what we should have done. But that's not fair. What we did great was we provided food to kids. We provided life-saving care to kids. We provided internet access where we could. And was it equitable? No. Was it equitable that a poor kid had to drive or walk to a school bus that had a Wi-Fi access spot to use a borrowed Chromebook? No, absolutely not. It wasn't fair, but it was the best we could do with what we had. And now we can look at how do we create systems that are much more equitable. But that starts in a classroom too, and looking at what we can do as teachers to make sure that we're providing resources and we're providing instruction that can be accessed by everybody. So how does it apply to blended learning? Well, first is barrier-free access, as much as we possibly can. But it is our responsibility to make sure the services are available to all students free of any form of discrimination. years ago, when I was first became a serious graduate student, and I wanted to do research, and I was doing my thesis for my master's degree, and I wanted to study the flipped classroom. That's where I thought education was headed. I thought it was great. And the more I studied it, the more I didn't like it, because it didn't address this particular thing. It created a barrier to access because we were forcing students into a model where they had to work at home. And if they didn't have the access, they had to go somewhere else to get it. And some teachers tried to ensure that they were making sure their students had access by asking several questions. But these are the questions that need to be asked. Does a student have reliable internet access at home? Because just asking, do you have internet at home, doesn't answer the actual question that we want answered. Do they have access to that reliable internet access? If you just send a survey home and the parent reads, do you have internet access at home? The answer may be yes, even though it might be a hot-spotted cell phone, but it's still internet access. Are you being specific enough in your questions? The second one is, does the student have access to reliable school-appropriate technology? A smartphone is not an appropriate learning tool. Now, did I use them? And I'm an advocate of, I absolutely hate smartphone and cell phone rules. Put them away, never use them. That's not realistic. I'm an advocate of teaching them how to use them appropriately. But it is not an appropriate school level device for doing work. Even though there was one case where a woman did her entire dissertation on her smartphone, which is insane. It can be done, but it is not school appropriate. And is it reliable? Are they able to use the technology and access the internet reliably? And here's an issue where both of those two top questions can be yes, and the third question be no. What if a house, and a lot of homes, not mine because I'm ridiculous, but a lot of houses have one common computer for especially the kids, and now you have tablets and everything. But let's assume a family that can't afford for everybody to have their own tablet and smartphone. You may have one reliable computer, but if you have 3 kids, can they all access that reliably at the same time? The answer is obviously no. So if we're having a virtual learning environment and virtual school where you've got 3 students that are in a house that has one computer, can they all participate in a real-time class simultaneously? And they can't. So we need to see, what are the students actually, what do they have at home? And then finally, does the student have supports at home that address technical problems? Anybody that's ever incorporated technology into their classroom knows the frustration of passwords and login information and spending 5 minutes of your class period getting everybody logged in because they forgot their password because they keep changing it because they keep forgetting it. Do they have the support at home to address that? Can their parents do it? Are their parents home? Maybe they're being watched during the day by their 9th grade sister or brother who doesn't have any technical skill, because these kids can use technology. They can't actually do anything with it. So is there support at home to address that if they can't get to you? And these are important in a virtual environment that not every kid is going to have. If they're in my house, yeah, they not only have reliable internet access, they have stupid internet access at my house. They have ridiculous options when it comes to technology. I have 8 iPads. I have 2 27-inch iMacs right now because I'm working from home and I brought my work computer home. I have a stack of laptops out in my storage shed. I have ridiculous access and the ability to support it, but that's not every kid, and that's not even most. So what do they have? And somebody like me really has to take a step back and recognize that not everybody's as insane as they are when it comes to technology. Another area where equity applies to these kids is accessibility and accommodations. And this is an area that I will say we did not do a good job of in the spring. And we didn't do a good job because we didn't have the infrastructure, the support, the time to plan everything. We were thrown into an impossible situation. And this is across the board. This is K-16 or K-20 education. This was everybody. But we have to, now that we have the time to plan this, how are we going to accommodate and make our material accessible for all students, right? ADA, IDEA, and Section 504 still apply in online environments, and my argument is they're more critical now than they are in an in-person environment. I can see a student struggling and recognize if they don't have it. Things like video captioning have to be done because that's the law. And it is teachers who are responsible for this. And what I saw a lot of districts do, including a local one here in Lubbock, that said, well, put your content online. It's the responsibility of special educators to make sure the accommodations are met for their students. And that's not fair to the special educators, which is why a lot of them are walking away from it, was because so much extra work I put on them. But ADA is not special education. That's across the board. Video captioning for your videos that are online is a requirement of the Americans with Disabilities Act. You cannot ask a student if they need video captioning. It has to be there if they want it. That's the law. And I would not want to be that teacher in court that was being sued for not providing it and saying, well, that was special education. That's on us. We have to do that. And that's what makes all of this more difficult. And going back to that blended learning is more time saving. Are you kidding me? That takes time to caption a video, even with YouTube doing it automatically. Speaking of which, if we're going to have things online, we have to make sure that we're not violating the law doing it. Having an entire class posting on a public YouTube site or putting your Zoom class on YouTube for everybody to access likely violates FERPA. It also likely violates COPPA, but that's not really your problem, which is the law that puts special considerations for any child accessing the internet under 13. We have to pay attention to making sure that what we're doing isn't violating the law and violating the privacy rights of our students. And we struggle with this because we didn't necessarily know what this was and how to guide our teachers and our students through this. But it's something we do have to pay attention to now that we have the time to do so. The other thing, and if you were in my last presentation, or I strongly encourage you to come to my next one about child abuse and neglect, this is a little bit counterintuitive to what I'm saying in that, but videos and backgrounds. Forcing children to have their video and background on while you're teaching can be problematic. And was this huge discussion of whether we required it or not. And there's a situation where I'm gonna tell you, don't require it. Because what if your background is this? This is what your students have behind them, or worse. This is what they're seeing. This is what their classmates are seeing. So one-on-one, yeah, if you come to my next video or my next presentation, yeah, I'm gonna tell you, one-on-one, have the video on. See what's going on around, face-to-face with that kid. But if it's on an online in a group or in a whole class, don't force them to do this. Because imagine the humiliation of that being your background, and you can't control that. That's your parents. And the final one, and why I have this other presentation, is paying attention to abuse and neglect. And we need to look at that, which is why if you don't come, please watch the video recording of it, because it's a huge issue right now in online learning. So what happens this coming year? We've got coronavirus. Like I said, I've got Texas Tech football is now off, which is a huge moneymaker. So you know that was a hard decision for them to make. But what does it look like? It seems to be changing day to day. I don't know what Isleta is doing. I don't know that you know. I don't know that your superintendent knows exactly what it's going to look like come the first day of school. We might have just regular classes. We might be open. I don't think so. I think we're going to be here, where we're going to be fully online. But we might have a combination of the two. Even if we go to regular classes, parents are going to opt their kids out. That is going to happen. How do we set up a system that works for that? The most likely is this, that we have some regular, some online, and some kind of hybrid. And this may be the model of education going forward beyond the 2020-2021 school year. We may have remnants of all of this that trace through education for the next decade. So what do we do about it? And that's where I say blended and personalized learning comes to the forefront now. And we put that in every single one of these models, and that's what allows us to save ourselves as educators from creating 3 different classroom environments, 3 different instructional environments. Well, we can create one that works for all of them. So when I got asked this question, what does blended learning online look like? It was simple. Well, not so simple. It took me 2 days to come up with a model that we've been using forever. But this works across the board. And if we set up the beginning like this, we set up from go to have this type of model, we have trained the students or will train the students to do this, then no matter what happens, we're able to bring them together and have a good, cohesive instructional environment that is incredibly flexible to the learning environment. And not just for now, but I really think back to a middle school student I had a long time ago who had leukemia, and he was at home and he was living in a literal bubble, like he was in a negative pressure or positive pressure environment, and he was in a bubble. And I didn't have a good model, and we as a school didn't have a good model to teach him. This model would have allowed him to not only participate with me, but participate with his classmates. And he could have participated in class if we were structured this way. So there is implications for this outside of our current COVID crisis that we can use going forward. So I appreciate the time. If you have any questions, I know we got just a couple of minutes, but that's my email address. Feel free to reach out. I love absolutely working with teachers. If you have any questions, you're trying to figure out what works, resources, whatever, I do make myself available. And I appreciate your time. Thanks for coming.